What's up, everybody? I'm John Middlekauff. You know what I need you to do. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We got content for days reacting to every NFL game all the time, every single day. Subscribe, like the videos. Let's go. Okay, let's dive into a little mailbag. At Jon Middlekauff is the Instagram. Fire into those DMs. Let's start with Brooks. Is Micah Parsons toxic? Can you go scorched earth on the Cowboys like you did the 49ers? Um, you know what's funny is whenever I see like Micah Parsons trending, obviously he gives a lot of takes. I kind of appreciate that. And sometimes you see his take, and listen, I haven't agreed with the ball. When I first saw his take on McCarthy, remember him talking about players that worked hard and Mike doesn't work hard. Or when you just read his quotes, and then I listen to him talk, I'm like, I kind of like Micah. I don't. I've always had a soft spot for him. I think he's a pretty special player. Uh, and again, this is why print media is so dead. If you just see a title with a quote, you're like, oh, what's he talking about here? And then I hear him discuss something. I'm like, yeah, he might have a point. And I'm not saying he's right on everything. And I'm not even saying that I follow up with everything that he says. But I do think that he is a product of when you're on the Cowboys, like it or not, you are just a lead into a lot of these shows. And when you make news, because if you're Micah, you host a podcast, and a lot of times Micah reacts to things that are said about him, which I appreciate. I have no problem. I talk for a living. So how am I going to beat down someone else who also gives opinions? And I don't have to agree with them all. I bet a lot of you listen to me don't agree with all my opinions. Micah Parsons can play on my team. Now, I understand from a Cowboy standpoint, how much do you want to invest in him because you've given Dak and CD all this money. I think he's a pretty special player. I would say this: Micah has not been the problem for the Dallas Cowboys. He simply is not. So I think it's easy. Like he gave some comment on. I'll be honest, the Dexter Lawrence back and forth. Like I just don't care. Like I'm sorry, Dexter. Micah's a better player than you. And like, do you think he's the reason you haven't been winning? I just disagree with that. I mean, I think a big reason that you didn't make a run those couple years in the playoffs because Dak was throwing it to the other team. Because for 2 straight years, when you had the Niners on the ropes in the second year and that first year, I'm talking about the 3 straight years making the playoffs, and went lost to the Niners, lost to the Niners, lost to the Packers. The Packers, you got your ass kicked. And that happens. I mean, sometimes you just play an awful game and you get worked. 2 years ago, it happened to the Eagles. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers kicked their ass. Now, when you're at home, it sucks. But the other 2 games, it was Dak's fault. It was simply Dak's fault. Uh, I just think that I don't think he's toxic. I mean, I think we've seen kind of quote unquote toxic players. I think like a Terrell Owens maybe in his heyday. I don't view Micah that way. Now, I don't pretend to like have all the inside information in the locker room. I could probably text a coach that had worked there before, but I don't think around the league people view Micah as some of the quote unquote toxic players of the past. I do think anytime you put yourself out there and you talk a lot, you're going to make news when you're a player of his caliber and when you're on the Cowboys. So, if anything, you could say, like, is the podcast worth it? Well, when you're winning, it's awesome. When you have a shitty year, it's not great. And I think sometimes, like, when a player goes, we're going to win a Super Bowl or something, says some stupid stuff, I can't think of all Micah's takes off the top of my head. It's like, what's he supposed to say? Yeah, we're just going to suck for the next 3 years. So, I don't know. The only issue I ever had, like true issue I've had with Micah, was the comment he made about McCarthy with the Zach Martin thing, and then he like doubled down and pushed back against it. But I just thought it was wrong. He didn't handle himself right. But like he tweeted something about Brock Purdy, like welcome to paying a quarterback a lot of money. Like he's kind of factually right. If Brock Purdy was on the second year of his rookie deal, I don't think the 49ers would be doing this. You know, now I can't speak to, like I said, to the Dexter Lawrence situation, but I'm not bothered by Micah Parsons really at all. I know I understand there's a little NBA feel to him sometimes with the media stuff, but I have a longer leash and I'm a little more liberal with elite talents. If this was a guy not as talented as Micah, like I would have zero time or support for him. But like when you can bend the edge like that, I can deal with some of it. Congrats on the wedding. Got a question for you. Have you decided on a college football team that you'd like to follow more closely because you like what they have or think they can go all the way? I'd like to hear your reasoning. I would say this. I have Marcus Freeman and the Notre Dame Fighting Irish have gained a supporter. I'm very, very interested and fascinated to watch them moving forward because I think in the NIL era, it's a big advantage for them. I think, obviously, as it currently stands with their conference situation of not being in one and kind of setting up their own schedule, Marcus Freeman's clearly a stud. Uh, I like what they got going on, and I would say historically been a Notre Dame hater. And listen, sometimes I just don't like teams, and it's like, why don't you like that team? I don't know. I just don't like them. I just don't like that team. I don't really have any of those in the NFL. In college football, I have some of those. Like I don't like Ohio State. I just like rooting against them. And I would say Notre Dame kind of always fell into that too, and I've kind of pivoted. I actually used to say that about Texas. Like I just didn't like Texas. Sark's kind of grown on me. Maybe you get a little softer as you get older. I'm a 24-year-old diehard Bronco fan. Other than finally making the playoffs last year, we were irrelevant since Super Bowl 50. I believe Bo Nix is that guy, and Sean Payton has done an incredible job turning this team around. Just want to hear your thoughts about Bo and Sean, plus free agent additions, Hufunga, Greenlaw, and Evan Ingram. Well, your coach is big time. So you gave him $90 million because he's an elite coach. Now, he rubs some people the wrong way. I think, the question about Micah Parsons, Sean Payton has a lot of people that can't stand him in the NFL. He's got a massive ego. Some people that don't like him will tell you this guy thinks he invented football. But like, I don't know, most of the best people in their fields usually have a big ego. Now, some can be a little more humble in person, but they all believe the same thing inside. Sean just doesn't pretend not to believe it. And I would say one thing, him backing that up immediately with Bo Nix. I mean, a lot of people, let's face it, thought he was insane for drafting Bo Nix in the top 15. Thought it was almost like an arrogant, like I can make this guy, I can see things other guys can't. And then you watch Bo Nix as the season went on. He's not a perfect player by any means, but it's going to work. Now, is he going to be a top five player? Probably not. But can he just be, if you do a good enough job building the team, like look at Jared Goff and Jalen Hurts. Like you're telling me he can't be some version of like combined of those guys? Like Jared Goff can get rid of the ball very fast, and like Jalen is a good athlete. Now, I think Jared Goff is a much better pocket passer, and Jalen is a much more like true versatile threat. But like he can be a version of like those two guys because get rid of the ball fast is important with Sean Payton. And then at the end of the day, sometimes you're gonna have to make shit happen. What like Goff can't in terms of if he has to move. He's just, I mean, for NFL standards, is one of the worst athletes. Might be the worst starting quarterback athlete. Again, these are relative terms to NFL players, but you know, Bo Nix can. I think Bo Nix. We saw Jimmy Garoppolo have some good years for Kyle Shanahan. Derek Carr had some big time Pro Bowl years. I think can be a better version of those guys, but he's with Sean Payton and a well run organization. I'm pretty bullish on them. Hufunga and Greenlaw, I think the only question is like, Hufunga, one thing to tear your ACL, a lot of players have and bounce back. Then he had all these other injuries that I think kind of derailed the Niner situation. And they had another guy that they drafted, came in and played really well. The Greenlaw thing I just saw on Instagram that Adam Schefter was on one of the Denver radio shows and said that the 49ers did everything to try to flip him once he agreed to the deal with Denver. So the 49ers desperately wanted to keep him because I would too. Greenlaw's a big time player. And I think if Greenlaw gets the opportunity to essentially be the Fred Warner of Denver's defense, if he can stay healthy, I think like he could be a star. Like make several Pro Bowls, be like second team All Pro. Fascinating to watch. Now, if his leg, last year clearly overcompensating with the Achilles and pulling hamstrings, and it was just tried to come back off the injury. It was tough. So I'm a huge, Huge. Listen, I love Hufanga and Greenlaw. Those are my type players. Remind me of the 90s. You come into their space, they are looking to bleep you up. I mean, destroy you. They are. If you're a Bronco fan, if you're my age, think of like some of the '90s defenses. I mean, think of some of the Peyton, the Von Miller defenses with T.J. Ward and some of those guys they had back there. They would hit you so hard. That's what these guys will do. Charger fans are losing their mind. That Harbaugh and Ortiz are not using the $90 million in cap space during this free agency. I'm on the side of Harbaugh and Ortiz, trusting their judgment to build through the draft and develop their own guys and build a sustainable winner. But then the other side is the interior line was a complete dog shit last year, and they had an opportunity to bolster that area during free agency to protect Herbert a little more. Do you think they could have a more balanced approach? You have to remember that Ortiz comes from the Ravens, who, despite, I mean, having feels like they've sustained winning for 25 plus years. I know they've had a couple down years here and there, but for the most part, they have been one of the high end organizations in the league. They're not a huge splurge team. That's not really their style. If you said, how do you find a guard or a center? They'd go, we'll draft one in the second or the third round, and we'll turn that guy into an all pro, maybe even the fourth round. And what's Jim Harbaugh's background these last 8 years? Find guys on the recruiting trail and then develop them. So, do I want to spend, I don't know, whatever Aaron Banks got, $22 million a year? Do I want to trade for Jonah Jackson, who's making $18 million a year? Or do I think I can find the same version as a rookie, 85% of those guys, but makes $1 million? I think that's the way they look at it. The other thing is when you have cap space, you don't just need to use it, right? I mean, they were the fifth seed last year. They were the fifth seed. So they're not the Patriots where they're drafting whatever, third overall, which you could also say, or fourth overall. Patriots fourth overall is a stupid win at the end of the season from being number one overall. They have no talent. Like the Chargers have talent. Chargers were the fifth seed. So I think everything's going to be okay. Free agency is extremely overrated because you have to pay so much money. I live in Hawaii. We can play golf at Turtle Bay if this is a vacation destination for you. I've never been to Turtle Bay, but I would love to go. My daughter is getting engaged, and Nashville is a likely location for her wedding. Can you share the cost of yours? Congrats on the wedding. It's funny. Me and Maria were talking about that. It wasn't cheap. Now, we also we didn't have a big wedding, but we had a party on Friday night, the reception party where sometimes I've been to a lot of weddings where you just have like a dinner with the dinner party or the groomsmen and the all the girls in the maid of honor and the bridesmaids. So you just have like a dinner. It's kind of smaller. We basically had because we didn't have it was just me and her up there with the officiant Guy Haberman that we just had a pre-party on Friday night and everyone was invited and we essentially rented out a place which for 3.5 hours with unlimited booze and food which will run you 15 to 20 grand. And we essentially did the same thing on Saturday night after the where we got married at the hotel and had dinner at the hotel, which Four Seasons is obviously not cheap, but relative to some of these cities, like it would have been 3x in New York City or Los Angeles or probably Dallas or some of these places. But we did 3 hours at the place where we got married and then had the dinner. And then I rented out on Broadway, uh, basically the first building. It's called Acme, the third floor, all to ourselves and a band, uh, which cost about I would say over $20,000. But that was like my curveball. You're coming to Nashville for me, destination wedding. Uh, we got a band, open bar. So there are ways like you could probably have it in Nashville depending on how many people you want to have for 50 grand. I would say if you wanted to blow it up. I mean that's the thing with weddings. Depending on how nice and bougie and what exactly you want to do, you could have hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, there are things that I had know nothing about that were there candles, flowers, the signage, shit that like I don't know, I don't even know what that costs. I just know listening to her talk, I don't think it was cheap and it was a pain. I mean, there are all these other costs. That's why the thing about wedding, besides just the venue and the booze, which is all I kind of thought about, there are all these um, extra additives that, especially as a guy or as a father, you don't really think about that get, you have to rent out, the chairs and the tables and just all this stuff that the flowers and the signage are things that would never cross your mind. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, this $5,000. This photographer is $4,000. It's easy for everyone to bitch and moan. And it's like, well, you're paying. Well, would you do it for half that? Would you give your entire day on a Saturday for what? You would not do that for $20 an hour. So why do you get mad with this other person? I didn't bitch at ever about the costs that people would charge. I mean, at first it's kind of glaring, and then you think about it, it's like, well, what these people do for a living. Factor in inflation. So I guess overall, no matter where you're going to get married, Hawaii, Nashville, or whatever, you can kind of, there are some controllable costs, how you want to do it. If you're just going to get married and have the party at the venue, you could take 30% off what I spent at the wedding. But a huge key to that is just, you know, do it all in one venue, which is not something I wanted to do. We wanted to mix it up a little bit. You only get married once, ideally. Question for the pod. Also depends how many people you got going. We only had 60. The Bears addressed a lot of offensive line concerns in two trades and free agency signings. At this point, I think I'd trade back and acquire more picks. Not a big fan of drafting a running back, wide receiver, or any skill player at this point. I trade back and take the best offensive or defensive lineman available. Thoughts on the move? Uh, I I've been pretty adamant when it comes to the Bears at pick 10. I would just take the best lineman on the board. Part of trading back, this is going to be a tough draft to trade back in because the differentiation of talent at pick 7 and pick 17 or pick 17 and pick 24 is not going to be viewed very different. Some years, that when the crop is a lot deeper and high end guys are viewed, in the NFL, from NFL GMs of like, hey, there are 22 first rounders. I think this draft, you're going to find some GMs who say that there are 10 first rounders in this draft. Well, there's still going to be 32 picks. So if I'm the Bears, I would ideally like take a defensive lineman. I think that would be the move. Take a defensive lineman at 10 and take a running back with one of my second day picks. Is there a text chain GMs use or a different type of software to make mass communication about which players a GM is putting up for trade? I got this wicked cold flu thing in Nashville that's still trying to shake. Yes, it's called Adam Schefter and Ian Rapsheet. So when you see on Instagram or Twitter or wherever you follow the news that so and so or Diana Rossini, a player is available via trade, a lot of times that is a team telling those guys to put out the bat signal because instead of texting everybody, it's easy to just do that. Or even if a guy requests a trade, and sometimes an agent can do this, it's like DK Metcalf has requested a trade or Debo Samuel has requested a trade. Sometimes a reporter breaks that. It's basically letting the entire league know because they get that information immediately. So I think the easiest way to tell, let's say I'm just going to use a complete hypothetical. I'm Jonathan Gannon and I'm the head coach of the Cardinals. And you know what? He's been the opposite of this, but I'm just going to use this guy as an example. Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray's available for trade. I would leak something to Adam Schefter probably. And then immediately the next day I would get 10 plus calls. And just because you get a call doesn't mean that anything's going to happen, but that's how you put out the bat signal. I have a strong feeling that Kyle Shanahan will be on the hot seat soon. There will certainly be some sort of pressure from the fans if things don't start well next year. I don't see the front office wanting him to be done, but do you think there will be pressure this year now that they paid Purdy and this whole Ayuk situation? I could see an Andy Reid type situation playing out for him the next few years unless things change. I think he means Andy in Philly. I have a hard time with this one. And listen, Kyle can drive me nuts, but you fire Kyle tomorrow. Who are you hiring that you feel better about? That was the thing with Andy Reid. They finally fired Andy Reid after an awful season. I mean, he won 4 games. So if Kyle has a 4-win season, yeah, it'd be a problem. But let's say Kyle goes 9-8, which I still think would be shocking given the schedule, which is not very good. You're going to fire him for who? Because they did for Andy Reid and they hired Chip Kelly. And then 3 years later, Dom was escorting Chip Kelly out of the building. Now, it ended up working out. Doug, a couple years later, wins Super Bowl, but where did they get Doug from? Andy Reid. So if they fired Kyle Shanahan, what would they do? Try to hire a Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay guy? Like, they're not hiring some like meathead defensive coach. What are you going to do? Hire Robert Saleh? Well, then who's going to run the offense? Kyle Shanahan guy? Is Robert Saleh any good? I think it's very, very easy to talk about this. You know, Andy Reid was there 14 years. Kyle Shanahan's going into year 9. So I still think it'd have to get really ugly. I think at minimum, unless something like crazy off the field were to happen to Kyle, which I think is pretty unlikely, given that he's just a football family guy, that I think he's got like 3 years minimum, even if things get weird. He's got a lot of time. So the fans obviously can get edgy and get pissed off, but I think he's got a pretty long runway. Now, maybe you go 6-11, maybe you got 2 more years after the 6-11 thing before it even becomes a tangible conversation. But I think there's no way possible he's on the hot seat this year. Now, if in a couple years they paid Purdy a lot of money and it's a disaster, yeah, I would say everything would be on the table. If LSU goes 9-4, the other thing is you fire Kyle Shanahan. God, um, think how fast he would get hired. The Eagles fired Andy Reid. I don't even think he was on the unemployment line for a week. And he had like 3 options. It's like the Arizona Cardinals, the Chargers, the Chiefs. I think that would be Kyle. And I actually think Kyle would have way more options than even Andy had. I think Kyle, there would be teams that would fire their coach to be interested in hiring Kyle Shanahan. Or if he would agree to be their coach, they would then just fire the guy that would have the job. And for as like much as he can drive you nuts, never forget the York family, John, Denise, Jed, that'd be his parents and Jed, have hired guys like Michael Singletary, Jim Tom Sula, Chip Kelly after Don threw him out the building. So they haven't exactly had a stellar record beside Kyle Shanahan of hiring coaches. They also told Jim Harbaugh to pack his shit and leave. So I'm hesitant to go, yeah, just let Jed go hire a new coach. You think John Lynch is going to like fire Kyle Shanahan? The only reason I think he'd quit, he'd go work at Amazon. If LSU goes 9-4, I think Brian Kelly will get fired. The pressure is on Brian Kelly. Last week in an interview, he said that LSU has 26.5 million in NIL allocated for the next 2 years. LSU also has the number 1 rated transfer portal class this season. Kelly also has a preseason Heisman in favorite in Garrett Nussmeier. If Kelly is fired, do you think LSU could land Deion Sanders as its next head coach? I think Sanders plus LSU would be dynamite. Uh, I think if Deion this year wins 7, 8 games, so he gets rid of Shador, gets rid of Travis, and his team's just good. And again, you win 7, 8 games in Colorado. That's pretty impressive. I think if a guy like Brian Kelly, Florida came open, I think he would be really, really high on their list. And I think he would 100% be offered and probably take these SEC jobs. Uh, I would say the other thing is when you look at coaches when they get fired, programs usually go the opposite. And part of Brian Kelly was like this old school, tough guy, uh, really by the book, just knows how to run a program. Kind of the opposite of Eddie O. And I think Dion has some Eddie O qualities. People like Dion's better. Eddie O won a national championship 2019. Many consider the greatest team of all time. So, yes, I would say that Dion would have a very, very good chance if Brian Kelly was fired of I think he would immediately I mean, obviously, who knows how things play out, but immediately be one of their top targets. Now, he couldn't have I don't think he'd be a top target if he won like 5 games, which I don't know. I mean, I have no clue what Colorado's going to look like this year. I would bet just because they're recruiting that they're going to be pretty solid. But quarterback play, just in general in college football, when you don't have a returning starter, you just never know. Now they recruited well. I think one of the guys that might start is like the 5-star guy, but who knows? I can't give you like a strong opinion because you felt pretty good. Like, hey, if their line of scrimmage got better, they got Shador, they got Travis Hunter, they could the Big 12, they could be a competitive team, and it turns out they were right. But I think anytime part of Dion as a coach, I mean, has been with Shador as his quarterback. Underrated transition. I mean, and one of the great college talents we've seen in recent memory, Travis Hunter. Those are two pretty big losses. I mean, that's pretty important. Travis Hunter never came off the field, and Shador was dynamic. So I don't know. I'm fascinated. I saw Marshall Falk they hired. They got a lot of former NFL guys. Big year for Dion. He wins 8 games, he's getting an SEC job. If he wanted it. I mean, who knows? There might be some shitty programs that offered him he's not interested, but like a Florida, an LSU, a job like that, I think 100%. With the league thinking about the 18th game, I was wondering what you think the best way to determine the game would be. I think picking the equivalent team from the opposite division would create cross-conference rivalries. An example, being this year the Lions in the NFC North would play the AFC North winner, the Ravens, or the Rams versus the Chiefs. Interested to hear your take. So right now, the 17th game, I'm pretty sure is like an opponent, a rotating opponent from the opposite conference, right? Where you finished in your division. If you're the Bengals and you finished third in your division, and this year the 17th game opponent is the NFC West, you would get matched up with the Arizona Cardinals. So you're saying every single year, if you are the AFC North, you would just match up with the NFC North. So the Bengals would play the Packers, and the Ravens would play the Lions, right? And in your example, the Chiefs would play the Rams. Yeah, I mean, I don't hate it. I do think they would do a rotate. I think they would keep it as a rotating, and they would just do the rotating NFC, which I I haven't even thought about it, to be honest with you. But I don't know if it really matters. I don't think you could just do something consistent every year because even if you did, I actually don't hate the conference. So basically, you rotate the 3 divisions and you always play your division, but in the NFC. So if you're the West, you play the West. If you're the South, you play the South. I can get behind that. I think it'd be hard to top a better idea than that. You could also do right now, basically your strength of schedule. You typically play 2 of the 4 conference teams. So if you're the Chiefs, basically every year the Chiefs are playing the Ravens and the Bills, and then they rotate between the other conference. So essentially, you play all the teams, all the first place teams in your conference. Uh, so yeah, that wouldn't even. I'm thinking out loud. Yeah, I like your idea. I could get behind your idea for sure. When it comes to college basketball and March Mania, one thing is for sure: nothing's for sure. Upsets, buzzer beaters, Cinderellas, top seeds going home early. It's all gonna happen. Bet the unexpected. Every upset, every day with DraftKings Sportsbook. With live betting, exclusive content, promos, and parlays, DraftKings is the ultimate college basketball destination for March. Ready to make your first bet? Check out matchups and pick a team to win. It's that simple. First time, here's something special just for you. New DraftKings customers bet 5 to get 200 in bonus bets instantly. Bet the unexpected with DraftKings Sportsbook. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app. Use the code JOHN, that's J-O-H-N. That's code JOHN for new customers to get 200 in bonus bets when you bet just $5. Only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. For the mailbag. Given the resurgence of guys like Darnold, Geno, and Baker, it seems to me that talent evaluators, scouts, GMs are doing a good job. And it's poor coaching. That prevented those guys from having success where they were drafted. Do you generally agree with this, or am I simplifying it down? Don't be biased as a former scout. It is much easier to evaluate. Let's just use this as an example. If I'm taking my bias out, evaluate a player than to coach a player. So, like, there are going to be more, if you just went around the league, I would say solid to above average scouts and guys that if you just let them pick your players, your team would be fine, than good coaches. Like, most coaches can't be coordinators, let alone head coaches. Or most, I would say, semi smart, ambitious scouts could be college directors if they really got the opportunity or wanted to be. So it is easier to watch Baker Mayfield and go, he's a good prospect. If you watch him play those years at Oklahoma, he could fucking play. Should he be the first pick? Should he be the seventh pick? Should he be the 15th pick? We can debate that. But no human being could watch Baker Mayfield play at Oklahoma and think he couldn't play. Not a soul. Now, there was some maturity and off the field issues, but taking that guy and then building an NFL offense around him is something a scout can't do. A general manager can't do, a pro personnel director can't do. Only a small percentage of coaches can do that. So it's it's why these guys make so much money. It's why actually I think a lot of scouts get jealousy is probably the wrong word, but bitter because they got no problem with Andy Reid or, Ben Johnson or Vic Fangio or you name Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, these guys that clearly are really good at their job. But a lot of these guys who, if you've just been grinding your whole career, and let's say you're 40 years old, you're my age, and you've been in the league for 15, 18 years, and you make 200 grand, which is a good living. But relative to how much you work, and especially if you're good at your job, and let's say you're like the SEC scout, let's say you make 250 grand. Relative to how much you work, and given the expense or the value of the organization in which you work for, in most industries you'd probably make like 800 grand, $1 million. But scouts a lot of times are very underpaid. Yet coaches, yet I have if I work for a team, let's say I got like 3 or 4 coaches, I'm like, I don't even think this guy's good. Well, the going rate for a quarterback coach is like 800 grand. So I got this guy making 3 or 4 times what I'm making. It's one thing if the guy's good. It's another thing is like, yeah, this guy doesn't know what he's doing, and we're gonna fire this guy at the end of the season. So the pay scale for scouts and coaches is a little out of whack. Again, a highly paid, a good coach should make the most of anyone in your building, not a player. But there are probably half the league are guys that you could replace yesterday and not even blink, and they're making 2, 3x like scouts that are pretty important. So I'd argue the scouts, a good one, are technically or consistently underpaid. But I would agree with your assessment that it's just harder to coach guys. But there are less good coaches. I guess this is a long-winded way. I'm like, he probably feels like I'm trying to stick up for him. But look at Baker Mayfield. When did he thrive? He had a little success with Stefanski, and then he went with Liam Cohen and Canales and had a lot of success. Well, what are those two guys? They're head coaches. Say this for Canales, like by the end of the year, you went, God, Bryce Young looks pretty good. Last year, Baker threw like 43 touchdowns. Like, I think Liam Cohen knows what he's doing. How would you rank the coaches in the AFC West? Obviously, Andy is one, but how would you order the other three coaches? I think you'd have to look at it like this. If I owned a team, Would I? And I think you had because you could make the argument for Pete Carroll if this was 10 years ago. Because you have to ask their general managers, like, is Pete easy to deal with, or does he just feel like fun loving and actually kind of difficult? Because I think there might be some of that. But given that it's 2025, I think Pete would have to be last. But we're 6, 7 years removed where Pete, I think, could easily be the number two pick in this. So if Pete's your fourth, you're in pretty good shape. If I owned a team, who would I hire? Jim's a little quirky. All coaches are a little weird, but you can have conversations with Sean and Andy. I think sometimes Jim could be difficult to conversate with. And if I owned a team, if I'm picking two guys that I know I'm going to win with, I would probably want the guy that's just easier to communicate with on a daily basis. But I the one thing I do feel like with Sean Payton over, difference with him and Harbaugh, Sean Payton's going to be the boss. So I'm basically like with Andy lets Veach pick the players. Like Sean Payton's picking the players. And it's one thing with a quarterback, no problem. If my head coach wants to pick the quarterback, but do I want him picking my D tackle and my okay? It's just that's a balance too. So I guess I would go Sean Payton, but I don't think you go wrong. That's a tough question. I think Pete Carroll just acting like the fourth. That's pretty crazy. Really quick, also let me start this one over. The one thing with Sean Payton different than Jim Harbaugh is like with Jim. Now, Greg Roman's probably not going to get a head coaching job, but like Jesse Minter will. So he's very dependent on who he hires as coordinators. With Sean Payton, I can never lose my offensive coordinator. I can never lose. My offensive coordinator is always my head coach. So I think thinking back, like I will, if all things are pretty close to being equal, I will take the coach that calls plays because that is one thing that I will never have to replace. And if both guys are going to win, that means you're going to lose coaches. And they both could lose defensive coordinators to become head coaches. I mean, Vance Joseph could easily get another shot if his defense keeps looking like that. But if Greg Roman, he'd probably have to get fired. That would mean he got fired by both Harbaugh brothers if he did. But I don't know if Jim loves him more than John. Thought for the mailbag. To add more interest, drama, rivalry to the playoffs, the top seeds get to publicly pick the team they want to play in the playoffs. It would also add more incentive for the lower seeds to beat the higher seeds. This doesn't just apply to the NFL. I think all sports could benefit from this. You know who would never vote for this? The teams. Because if you're the Chiefs, if you're the Eagles, if you're the Lions, think of yourselves as the top seeds. It's easy for the team you're going to play to have a lot of motivation, right? Like when the Commanders went into Detroit or when the Rams went into Philly, they were a big underdog. They knew it. They don't even have to talk about it. Like no one thought that they could win. If I choose you, which is incredible, like I want to play the Green Bay Packers. They're not only the underdog, I just gave them the best, easiest motivation in the history of sports. So I think the good teams and every coach worth their salt should view themselves like my team can be good and we aspire to be there. Would not want that. So if I was an owner or definitely if I was a league office official, I would want it. But I don't think the teams would. Do you think there is one specific factor that leads to most players busting in the NFL? Is there anything that comes up on tape or during face-to-face meetings that is an instant red flag to you? What's funny is like Solomon Thomas is a guy that is going to be viewed as maybe not a bust because he's going to have a 12-year NFL career, but a guy that never lived up to being drafted third overall. But it wasn't his fault that the 49ers overdrafted him. He did not have the skill set. He wasn't big enough to play just strictly defensive tackle and dominate inside. He wasn't twitchy enough and bendy enough to be a dominant edge rusher. He was kind of just a tweener. And he's developed just a solid role. He plays hard. He's strong. He's good against the run. He gets some just extra effort sacks. And that's why he's going to play in the league a long time. but he was overdrafted. If you had drafted a guy like him in the third round, you go, we drafted this guy in the third round. He played in the league for 11 years. Like, that's a great pick, even if he only plays for your team for 4 or 5 years. But the reason a guy like him can go, well, this guy is not that good, but then all of a sudden you look up, he just plays forever because the intangibles are off the charts. And I think the biggest reason guys quote unquote bust is because they don't like football. And not liking football means you don't play that much football. Anyone can get up for a football game. They're fun. There's 70,000 people watching you. There are rah-rah speeches before the game. You just, the buzz of a stadium, there's nothing like it. You know what sucks? Studying film Tuesday afternoon on your off day. Going to the weight room before practice on a Wednesday when your body still hurts. Putting in that extra film work on Thursday afternoon, 4 days before the game. Doing extra treatment so your body feels well on Friday and Saturday. And the intangible love of the sport, because certain guys, like, if you just play hard, your skill set is so elite. Derek Stingley is one of those guys, has an elite skill set. So if the guy likes the game and takes the coaching, he should be a good player. Now, he clearly is all in. He's got good coaching, and he's become an excellent player. And then there are some guys whose skill set are kind of average, but they overcome it because they give you 100% effort 7 days a week. And I think the biggest reason most guys quote unquote busts or aren't good football players, clearly some guys skill set, like he just couldn't separate as a wide receiver. And it's like, I can't get open, I can't get open. I think most guys, like, I don't know how much they like football because football's really hard. Because unlike basketball and baseball, you don't get to play that often. So most of the things you do around the game of football don't really have that much to do with putting on full pads and playing against another team. Their practice, they're the weight room, their meetings, their walkthroughs. It's a grind, man. It's why the best players are addicts. They love the sport. They get joy in playing, but they also love grinding and working. Like when I think of the two best players of my like adult life, Brady and Manning, for as great as they were on Sundays, what really defined them was like how addicted they were on all the other 6 days and how much time they spent grinding film, practicing, going above and beyond. And that's what and Drew Brees, that's what made them great players, right? And that's the one thing with Aaron Rodgers. Like, did he love to do it as much as them? I don't know. I mean, I think it's up for debate. So I would say it's usually an intangible characteristic. Dan Patrick interviewed Jon Gruden and asked him several questions about the lawsuit. I've listened to Patrick for a while, and I know he's a legend in sports broadcasting, but I felt he was going after Gruden, especially after Gruden made it clear he was not interested in talking about the lawsuit. I think Dan knew it didn't go well because after the interview, he explained that he had to ask those questions to be fair. To me, it didn't come across as being fair. Just thought I'd ask your opinion about your interview philosophy and if you believe the age of clickbait has changed the intent of asking those questions. Coincidentally, your interview with Jay Gruden was one of my favorite episodes ever. Well, I don't do many interviews on this show. I should do more, and I plan on ideally doing more in the off season. But like Dan Patrick is one of the greatest sports interviewers in the history of society. So when you're an older, like to me, if you come on my show, when I ask people to come on my show, and I've heard a bunch of no's with famous people, I tell them like, hey, anything you don't want to talk about, I will not talk about. I'm not a big J. I'm not doing journalism here. If there's something going on that, it's something it's pretty easily avoidable, I'll avoid it. I'm asking you to come on my show. I think Dan comes from just a generation that like I don't view myself as a media guy. I'm just a guy that likes sports. I talk about it. Luckily, a lot of people find it entertaining, and we bullshit about football and life here. But like I understand you can't have on Jon Gruden and not ask like what's your situation with the league. If you're Dan Patrick, if I had on Jon Gruden, it would never come up. I don't care. When it plays out, it plays out. Plus, like Dan Patrick also is not trying to get clickbait. Like I mean, you're talking about a guy who's worth millions of dollars. he views it as like one of the big stories with Jon Gruden is like, what is your status with the league? For me, it's like I'd rather just ask him questions about like Max Crosby or what he thinks about like Justin Herbert. I don't. So I think everyone has a different angle. I think Dan is being a professional, and I think if you wanted to say like I'm not a professional, and I would say you're right, I'm not. I'm just running a podcast business here, trying to be entertaining. Dan is, much more of an old professional. I mean, I guess I don't know how else to say it. I did watch. I think you're talking about an interview that was probably, I don't know, not even 6 months ago, but during the season. I don't view sometimes, quote unquote clickbaity. I also think clickbait, that is a that word is misused a lot, especially on like Twitter. That was for a generation of writers because they made their money on, like, if you clicked on my article, and if I got however many, let's say 100,000 people that looked at the article, I could sell it for a certain amount. The way that, I mean, if you're either using my game time promo code or not. Middlekauff, this was a clickbaity what tweet? I Elon's never paid me a penny. There's never been any such thing as a clickbaity tweet or a anything from me. Because to me, a clickbait, I would say, basically is saying that you're trying to make money off whatever someone's clicking on. And I think it gets misused a lot. Like Dan's just asking him questions, like you're already there watching it. So I just think he's trying to be professional. And some people are big J's, and some of us just are not. And I think it's just a different tactic, which how we approach everything. So, yeah, let the cream rise and go from there.